Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brown at Eye of Brown. Hope everyone's doing all right. And today we are going to be talking about the Dead Pit. And right off the bat, I just want to say that I love this cover art here. And if I remember correctly, this Blu-ray release used the exact same artwork that was on the original VHS release that came out a long time ago. And that release actually had a very neat gimmick wherein you pressed a button on the cover and the zombie's eyes would light up. And unfortunately, they weren't able to replicate that for the Blu-ray release, but just the fact that Code Red, the company that came out with the Blu-ray, just the fact that Code Red went ahead and used the original artwork, was a nice touch in my opinion. But The Dead Pit came out in 1989 and it was directed by a gentleman named Leonard, who is the same guy who would go on to do movies such as The Lawnmower Man, Hideaway, and Virtuosity. A bit of a mixed bag to be sure, but I've always kind of, liked the movie The Lawnmower Man. And as they recently came out with the director's cut on Blu-ray, I came to really appreciate that movie that much more. And so it was really neat to see how the director of that movie started out with a low-budget horror movie. And this was actually a pretty good movie, all things considered. And I figured going in I'd have some fun with it because I've always liked horror, sci-fi, and fantasy movies from, say, like, the 80s and 90s, and sometimes the big high-budget successes, or whether it be cult classics that aren't necessarily big budget, but at the same time it's like there's still a certain amount of effort put in that makes them stand out. And this was a movie that definitely stood out from its peers in a lot of ways. It borrowed quite a bit from other movies, but at the same time there was enough originality put in to where, in my opinion at least, it stood out on its own, to where, it's a B movie, but it actually turned out to be a good B movie. And the story starts off, and I want to say it was like 1969, wherein this doctor, a guy by the name of Dr. Swan, is confronting a colleague of his, a guy named Dr. Ramsey, because Dr. Ramsey's been conducting unethical experiments in the mental asylum in which the two doctors work at. And he's been doing experiments on the patients, and to the point of, say, they're starting to become torturous. And Dr. Swan doesn't know the full extent of Dr. Ramsey's experiments, but he confronts him about him. But Ramsey refuses to quit and continues going on with the experiments. And so one night, Dr. Swan follows him into this hidden chamber, and he finds out that Ramsey has been not only torturing the patients, but he's also been killing them by way of lobotomizing them, and also doing experiments on the human brain. And so some of the patients horrifically are still alive, but they're in a very vegetative state, but a lot of them are in this proverbial dead pit that's in the chamber. And so after Swan confronts Ramsey about this, and Ramsey makes this insane statement about having done everything he could in life as far as experimenting and what have you. He's wanting to experiment with death. Dr. Swan shoots the guy in the head and walls the chamber off. We're talking like quicklime around the edges of the hidden door, and basically just blocks it all off and hopes that no one else will ever find the chamber. And so fast forward 20 years later, Dr. Swan's still in charge of the mental asylum, and one day a new patient comes in, a woman. Excuse me, I do apologize in advance, but I recently got over being sick, and so if I cough here and there, that's probably going to happen, so I do apologize in advance. But okay, so back to this plot of the movie. So one day, a woman by the name of Jane Doe shows up at the asylum as a new patient, and no one knows who she is. She doesn't know who she is, and she has a strange story about how she, she knows that she has a past, but even though she doesn't know who she was, she's convinced that she knows how she lost her memory. She's convinced that someone experimented on her and surgically removed her memories. And so even though she remembers that, she still doesn't remember who she was originally. But on the same day that she arrives at the asylum, this earthquake breaks out, and there's quite a bit of damage that's done. I mean, no casualties or anything like that, but there is structural damage done to the buildings of the asylum. And unfortunately, one of those areas that's hit is the chamber that was walled off by Dr. Swan all those years ago. And what ends up happening is, the seal of the chamber is broken, and Dr. Ramsey comes back from the other side and continues his experiments on the patients that he was performing all those years ago. And he seems to have a special interest in Jane Doe, and she keeps having nightmares, whether they be waking nightmares or nightmares when she's trying to sleep. Dr. Ramsey keeps on appearing to her as this blood-drenched, clawed specter, and no one else can see him, it seems like. But nonetheless, he is going around killing, patients and staff members of the asylum alike. And so Jane Doe, tries to get someone to believe her, but the staff, naturally, they think she's having a nervous or a mental breakdown, and so they start trying to prescribe her all this medication, and which doesn't really help her. And then on the other hand, she does make friends with other patients in an attempt to get someone to believe her. And eventually, she and some of the other patients end up trying to survive by confronting Dr. Swan about who this blood-drenched specter is. And Dr. Swan's forced to admit that he had a part to play in the horror that's been unleashed on the asylum. And this is a movie that I think the premise was pretty simple in terms of what the setup was, but they did a very good job of making the movie and the story memorable because, amongst other things, the film was shot in a genuine mental asylum, and it was actually parts of it, if I remember correctly, were abandoned and were genuinely derelict and dilapidated. And so there was this creepy atmosphere that actually got to some of the cast members, and so some of the tension that you see in the movie was undoubtedly real, at least on some of the actors and what you see with the characters on screen. And there was also some of the patients that you see on screen. You had some that were actors playing patients, but then you actually had genuine mental patients. And so it's sort of like they all combined together in this one big group in the movie. And so it was interesting in that respect because you see sort of this genuine portrayal of insanity, and some of those portrayals are genuinely done by insane people. So anyway, the authenticity definitely kicked this movie up a notch, in my opinion. But there was also enough time given to getting to know certain characters, and to a point where, we're not talking, say, 4-star or 5-star award-winning material or anything like that, but enough character development is given to some of the cast of characters, to where you get invested in what's going on, or at least I was actually invested, and I actually wanted to see what happened next. And so when, say, bad things started happening to certain characters, there was definitely a case of me thinking to myself, get out of there, or don't go in there, or if something very gruesome happened, I mean, it was just kind of like, oh yeah. And I mean, because I will say that when the gore is used in this movie, even though it's done on a low budget, it's actually pretty well done, and it's pretty convincing, for what it is. And also, when it happens to, say, a character who's been given some character development, or whenever something nasty happens to a character who's been given character development, there is that bit of, oh, in the sense that you kind of, latched onto a certain character, and okay, even though a lot of these characters are probably going to die, they're not just static characters who show up and you don't give a damn about them. I mean, these are characters that have some substance, and I actually appreciated that. And in a lot of ways, I think the movie, I mean, as I said, it borrows from quite a few other movies. I mean, you have the Night of the Living Dead, for sure, because I mean there is a zombie outbreak in the movie. Although these aren't cannibalistic zombies, these are just like mind-controlled zombies, kind of like the zombies from Lucio Fulci's The Beyond, in a sense that in that movie the zombies weren't cannibalistic, but they were under the control of something, and they were attacking the protagonists. But this is a similar case in the sense that these zombies are all people who have been lobotomized and killed by the undead Dr. Ramsey, and they're all under his control. And so, I mean, you have that feel, because I mean, you got that vibe of Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and Lucio Fulci's The Beyond, but you also have shades of Nightmare on Elm Street because of the atmosphere of the movie, of this sort of unrelenting dread, just based on how decrepit and creepy the actual asylum is. And also a lot of the camera work does a good job of sort of conveying this nightmarish, dreamlike perspective of, say, in certain scenes when characters are running from something or trying to find someone. I mean, things kind of are off kilter to where you feel like you're watching something that's coming from someone's chaotic dream. And I thought that was pretty cool. So it's definitely a Nightmare on Elm Street feel to it as well. But I also, I mean, I haven't seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but I have heard that a certain character does have a lobotomy in that movie. And so, when you got this antagonist who has a fondness for doing lobotomies on mental patients, I mean, that there's definitely a nod to that movie as well. But I do think that this movie predated, in terms of having, say, like a cast of characters in a sort of dark, nightmarish setting, that's, I mean, characters who are trapped at some place against their will, and they're in a sort of nightmarish situation. The Dead Pit predated movies like, say, David Fincher's Alien 3 or Stuart Gordon's Fortress. And in those movies, they were set in, it was like a science fiction type setting, or maybe some horror thrown in for sure. But those movies had like prison settings, but they had like a memorable cast of characters in both cases. In Alien 3 with the assembly cut especially. But I was watching the Dead Pit though, and there are moments though where I'm thinking, okay, I'm wondering if the people who made Alien 3 and Fortress, got some inspiration from the Dead Pit, in the sense of having the creepy and unsettling environment of, say, like a prison or a mental asylum, and then they went ahead and made their movies with this interesting cast of characters. And speaking of the characters, They were actually pretty good. I mean, they were much better than I expected them to be. The guy who played Dr. Swan is an actor named Jeremy Slate, who sadly passed away a few years ago. He's a guy who had been in, or he was an actor who had been in a lot of movies from back in the day. We're talking, going as far back as, the John Wayne movie True Grit. And he was also in Brett Leonard's next movie, The Lawnmower Man. And so I thought that was, pretty neat how, Brett Leonard used some of the people from this movie in his very next movie, kind of, sticking with, people that he knows. And so that was pretty cool. But Jeremy Slate, though, he does a good job playing Dr. Swan. And he comes across as a character who is, I mean, a decent guy at heart, perhaps, but he definitely has his skeletons in the closet. And, over the years, he's tried to forget about his part in, Dr. Ramsey's experiments, and he, likes to think that, hey, he killed Dr. Ramsey, and that was his way of making amends. And of course, but on the other hand, he knows that he's complicit in Dr. Ramsey's crimes, and he was afraid that his career would be ruined, as would his life, if it came to light that he was in some way complicit with what Dr. Ramsey did, even though he didn't know the full extent until that night they killed him. But as more and more nightmarish events are transpiring in this asylum, Dr. Swan is being forced to realize that his sins have come back to haunt him in a lot of ways. And Jeremy Slate did a really good job, I think, of you see the transition of the character going from someone who's calm and level-headed and genuinely wanting to help those under his care, but then you see how the nightmare situation is gradually taking its toll on him. He becomes more unnerved and I'm not going to say psychotic, but you definitely see that he's close to having a breakdown. And so Jeremy Slate did a really good job in the part. And it's kind of it was a bummer to find out that he passed away not that long ago. As far as the guy who played Dr. Ramsey, the undead antagonist, he was played by a gentleman named Danny Gokner, I think is how you say his name. But he, I think this was the only movie he was ever in, but he does a pretty good job playing the bad guy, and he does a good job physically as well as when he's saying his lines, but just the way he moves and the way that he looks. Even before he becomes undead, there's something very creepy about him. And of course, when he becomes undead, the makeup department, they did a good job of making him look scary. But the way he moves, it's very abrupt and startling. And so they did a good job with making him actually be scary. And so whenever he's on screen, there's this whole kind of edge of your seat type feel. At least there was for me, simply because of, it would have been one thing if he just looked creepy, but the way that he moved and the way that he physically performed with his character as this undead villain, he made the character stand out. And Cheryl Lawson, she does a pretty good job as Jane Doe, and I think that this was her. I don't remember for sure if this was her first movie altogether, but I think she went on to do a lot of stunt work in other movies. But she did a good job of acting in this movie because she did a good job of playing someone who had lost their memory, and she doesn't know what happened. She doesn't know why she's been picked up and put in a mental asylum. But at the same time, though, she knows she's not crazy, but she knows that there's something wrong with her. And, you kind of feel sorry for her in a lot of ways but at the same time, you become invested in her character because there are moments where she's trying to find out what's going on, but then she starts to become caught up in the sway and mental control of Dr. Ramsey. And so when you see her going from being under her own control and then going under the control of the villain, it's a pretty good performance. Both in terms of dialogue as well as physical movements and what have you. And she actually works and plays well with the other actors as well. And so when she's bonding with some of the characters, it really does have this feel of camaraderie, and it sort of makes you, or at least it made me care more about the main character. And one of the other characters I liked was the character of Christian, and he was played by a guy named Stephen Gregory Foster. And I want to say I've seen him in something, but I can't really think. Maybe he just has one of those faces. But I don't think that he was really in much of anything that I know of. But he did a pretty good job in this movie. But he plays a guy who isn't necessarily insane, but he unfortunately, he was in the military, but he has too much of a fondness for blowing stuff up. He's really good at making improvised bombs, and unfortunately, one of his, I guess pastimes, one of his latest antics caused a little too much damage, and not to the point where like he's going around, killing people or anything like that, but he just likes to blow things up. And so unfortunately, this, I guess he blew up the wrong building, or he blew up the wrong property, or, he did more damage than thought. And so he had a choice of, okay, going into a federal prison or serving out a sentence in a mental asylum. And so, well, his lawyer was able to, talk the, court into getting him, sent to a mental asylum instead. So you got this guy who isn't insane necessarily. It's just that, he had a rather destructive hobby that caught up to him, I guess. But he's actually a relatively easygoing guy. And it's interesting seeing how this supposedly destructive individual is actually one of the people who's trying to keep everything together when things are hitting the fan. He's trying to keep the patients from being abused by certain orderlies when things start to get chaotic. And he's also trying to show Jane Doe the ropes of surviving the place, and he's trying to look out for some of the other characters when things are getting weird. Like if he sees certain characters acting strangely, he's like, okay, I know you're crazy, but this isn't you. What's going on here? He's one of those types of characters. And so, some of the other doctors, they come across as maybe not necessarily nice, but they come across as, hey, we're genuinely trying to do our jobs. And so, it's interesting seeing him play off of those characters. But I liked his character though. And like I said, I just found it ironic that he has destructive habits outside the asylum, but once he's in the asylum, he's one of the few people who ends up trying to keep things together once bad things start happening. And a lot of the other characters that showed up I thought were intriguing. And one of the characters is actually a nun who, I forgot exactly what happened to her to be sent there, but just, I guess she had a nervous breakdown or she just went crazy at some point. But, she has this habit of blessing everyone with, what she says is holy water. Like she'll bless a cup of water and then cast this water on everyone around her. And so this actually comes in handy in the climax of the movie, because these undead servants of Dr. Ramsey, they do not like holy water. And let's just say that a water tower is at the asylum, and when you have a nun who can genuinely bless water and make it holy, how do you think that the climax is going to go down? With a water tower and undead zombies. And so that was actually a nice original touch, I thought. Anyway, though, yeah, this was a pretty cool movie, and it's one of those things that I went in expecting just maybe a fun B movie, but it was actually pretty good. And the characters I appreciated, because of how much substance was given to a good amount of them, and how even the minor characters came across as believable, but also just the horror aspect of the movie. Just because of how nightmarish the setting was, and then just of how terrifying Dr. Ramsey is, and both in terms of physical mannerisms and just in terms of what he's doing to the patients who aren't able to really defend themselves against him. And so, I mean, it was a combination of I guess, someone abusing their power over those under their care, and also you have the supernatural aspect as well, in the sense that he's undead. And so but you have a very terrifying antagonist, and then once the zombies come into play, the people in charge of the makeup for them did a very good job. I mean, considering that they had a low budget to work with. But the zombies, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, they weren't like they aren't cannibalistic zombies, but they're more like zombies under the control of something, or that's what they are, actually. But instead of eating people that they're going up against, they literally just start tearing them apart, and it's pretty gruesome. And so also, the actors playing the zombies did a very good job, because they are very twitchy, very they really move like something's controlling them. It's sort of like jerky and robotic, and you have that ominous growling and moaning sound that comes from them. And so very, very creepy zombies. And so that was the main thing. The horror of this movie was actually very well done. And I will say, there was a point in the movie where one character he's been lobotomized. Not lobotomized, but he's had the top of his skull removed, and Dr. Ramsey is doing experiments with his exposed brain. Like, he's putting these pins in the poor guy's head, and like and literally into the guy's brain, and it's one of those deals where, I mean, it looks gruesome as all get out, and but it's morbidly fascinating, though, because I mean, it could have just been a cool looking special effects moment, but the actor playing the guy who's being tortured like this, he does a good job of going through like a wide range of I guess emotions, because when Dr. Ramsey's putting the pins through the poor guy's brain, he's hitting all sorts of buttons, so to speak. Like, at one point, he makes the guy experience a sense of pleasure by, going through a part of the brain that, deals with that part of that I guess, feeling. And then he puts another needle through another part of the guy's brain, wherein you got, I guess, the pain portion of things. And so the guy who's being tortured, he does a good job of, even though he's strapped down, he goes from, feeling euphoric to, gibbering and muttering and crying in fear and pain. And so it was like a gruesome set piece, but it was very well done, because of the acting of the guy who's being tortured. I don't want to say who it is, because it's one of the main characters, but also the guy who's playing Dr. Ramsey, does a good job of, just being straight up evil and, going on a bit of a motive rant while he's doing it. So, and if I remember correctly, that scene was actually cut out of the American releases. And so, for those of you who are interested in the Blu-ray, that scene is included in all its gruesome glory. So, this movie definitely, earns its place in the horror genre. It has a good premise, and it's well done. It's well shot. It's the setup is, they deliver on the setup, and they stick the landing. I think that the only thing that the only complaints I had were that some of the actors, unfortunately, aren't that good. And I mean, like, some of the side characters, and you could tell it's a sort of an amateurish effort, I guess, because of the this being literally Brett Leonard's first movie, and you know that going in. But the thing is, most of the actors actually do a good job in the part, and their parts they're playing, but there are some actors that unfortunately aren't that good, and they come across excuse me, they come across as actors you'd find in something like the Friday the 13th movies, in the sense that that they just aren't that good, and that they're only there to be killed, and you have no attachment to them, and so I guess that was like the one complaint I had as far as the movie itself, plus the fact that I guess the motive of the villain wasn't really elaborated on, and like that he's wanting to do something unethical. I mean, he's doing unethical experiments on the mental patients, but you don't really know why, and you don't really know what he's trying to accomplish. I mean, and don't get me wrong. I mean, he's a good villain, but it's just I wish that they'd gone a little more into why he's doing what he's doing. And I mean, you get a good scene where Dr. Swan's telling some of the characters about what happened all those years ago, but even then, he doesn't really, they don't really go into why Dr. Ramsey was doing all these horrible things. Like, was he just crazy, or was he genuinely trying to achieve something? And I guess maybe it's somewhere in between, but they never really say what it was he was trying to accomplish. So I guess, that didn't ruin the movie for me or anything like that, because like I said, he's a good, creepy, villain, and there's a genuine sense of menace there. But I just, in hindsight, it would have been nice to find out exactly what he was trying to do. And also, when the revelation of who Jane Doe is comes out, it feels kind of like something out of, you could kind of see it coming, but at the same time, it feels sort of out of left field, I guess. It's really weird because, you see it coming, but at the same time, when it happens, you're kind of like, what? And just you watch the movie, and you might understand what I'm talking about. Just the way it's conveyed, or the revelation is conveyed. And it's not a mark against Cheryl Lawson, because she does a good job in the part. It's just that when you find out at the end, or towards the end, who she really is, and her connection to the evil Dr. Ramsey and what have you, it's both predictable and at the same time sort of like a moment. But anyway, though, those were the only really issues I had with it. I could say that the movie, if a movie being derivative bothers you, just bear in mind that it does borrow from a few other classic horror movies, but that wasn't really a problem for me. I actually enjoyed the movie. And I will say that as far as the Blu-ray release itself, there's a good commentary track, with Brett Leonard and some of the other cast and crew, but also there were some interviews with Brett Leonard, Cheryl Lawson, as well as the producer. How do you say her name? Gimel Everett. And she was also one of the screenwriters as well. She and Brett Leonard both wrote the movie. And so you have some interviews with Brett Leonard, Gimel Everett, Cheryl Lawson, and also, let's see, who else was there? And you also have an interview with the late Jeremy Slate. And that bit was kind of bittersweet because, I mean, he seemed like he's one of those actors. I mean, just in an interview, I mean, he seemed like a nice guy, and you could tell that he'd had a life full of unique experiences. Just based on the interview alone, and plus the recollections of Brett Leonard whenever he was talking about him, and so and he seemed like a pretty cool, down to earth guy, and so there was a nice little tribute message left at the end of his interview, saying something along the lines of thank you very much for the memories, we miss you, and so I thought that was kind of a nice touch. But the one downside to this Blu-ray release though is that a good amount of the time the dialogue itself is hard to hear because I guess maybe they they only had certain negatives to work with in terms of restoring the movie from one media to another, and so a good amount of the time it's hard to understand what the characters are saying, and unfortunately there's no subtitle options. And so I understood what was going on, and I understood enough of the dialogue to in the moments where it was hard to understand the characters. I understood enough of the dialogue to understand what was being said, but at the same time, in those moments though, it was hard to hear what was being said through this muffled noise that you're hearing. I mean, a good amount of the time, you're able to, hear what the characters are saying, but there's more than a few moments though where the dialogue is muffled, and the speakers I have, I mean, they're pretty good speakers, and so I mean, I'm pretty sure it wasn't them, but I think the people who did the Blu-ray release, I mean, it would have been nice if it would have been one thing if they had tried to work with I guess the sound, but maybe they couldn't enhance the sound anymore at a certain point, and so it would have been nice if they'd thrown in the option of having subtitles. But that's the only quibble I have with the Blu-ray itself. But yeah, so Brett Leonard's The Dead Pit was actually a good horror movie, and it was sort of like night and day for me because, I mean, the last review I did was for a B movie called Super Hybrid, and that was a killer car movie, and it sucked. So it was nice to go from a movie like that to a movie like this, which in both cases I knew going in I was going to be watching a B movie, but it was nice to actually get a good B movie here. And so those of you who like zombie movies, or anyone who likes movies like the Lawnmower Man, Hideaway, and Virtuosity, and want to see how Brett Leonard started out, definitely check The Dead Pit out. It was actually a good horror movie. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. If you like what you see here, please hit that like button and subscribe. If you got any questions, comments, let me know. Y'all have a good day. Bye.